one, footsteps matching mine at dusk. I started late to beat the heat and ended up earning the kind of dusk that turns the world flat and mean. The trail along the ridge was mostly roots and old leaves, the kind that snap softly and then remember you with a smell like wet tea. I was moving steady, no hurry, keeping to the center line where the rock poked through. You learn to let the trees tell you where to put your feet, the way their limbs lean, the way the ground sinks before it gives. The ridge fell off on my left into a laurel tangle, the kind you crawl through on hands and knees and come out with green scratches all over your arms. On the right, the pines crowded in, dark enough to feel like they were trying to fold the trail shut. I heard nothing for a while but my own breath, the small talk of a tired man trying to be brave to himself. The first time I noticed it, I thought it was my head. My right foot down, then my left, and right on the tail of each step came a second. Not louder, not softer. Same weight, same pace, like an echo that had learned how to arrive a fraction late. I stopped mid-stride and counted to 4 inside my mouth. The second rhythm stalled half a beat later, as though it needed to remember how to be quiet. It was the kind of pause you get from somebody carrying something heavy and not wanting you to notice. I said deer, even though deer don't keep time with a man. I said wind, even though wind doesn't have feet. I let my right foot down again, and the second step answered patient, like it had all night. I tried a trick I learned years back. I took 3 quick steps, cut left into a little pocket of rock, and turned without breathing. The ridge hummed in my ears, that empty electric quiet you get before a storm. Nothing moved. A soft piece of leaf came loose from somewhere and drifted down. Far down the slope, the creek changed its voice, as if it had cleared its throat. I stood there long enough for the gnats to find the sweat at my temples, then stepped back out onto the path. Right away, the second steps picked up again, not closer, not farther, just there, hanging a half breath behind mine, like a kid trying to walk in a parent's prints. The light was failing faster than I wanted. The trail thinned to a spine where you could feel the drop without seeing it, the way cold air moves up from a hollow and finds your ankles first. I shut off my headlamp because a white cone of light will make you a painting, and I wasn't looking to be framed. My eyes took what they could from the leftover day. When the ground leveled at a little saddle, I saw dust where the sun had dried the path earlier. It should have been dead grey, powdery. But there in front of me was a single boot print, not mine, wet-edged, holding a shine like it had been pressed just then. I stared at the tread. A blocky pattern. Not my brand, but close enough to live in the same store. The print sat ahead of where my next step would land. The toes pointed the way I was already going. I spoke, because that's the courtesy here. "I'm coming through," I said, not loud, not friendly, just factual and respectful. The mountains prefer that tone. The answer came from far too near. It sounded like me, like my voice pulled across gravel. "Keep going," it said, same rhythm as my words but off by a half beat, the way a tape recorder lags when the battery is dying. I felt my mouth go dry and stay that way. It wasn't a threat in the sound, not exactly. It wasn't help either. It was a rule being read aloud. I kept going. The steps behind mine fell back into place, patient, unhurried. I stuck to the clean rock wherever I could, not wanting to leave anything to read. The smell of the woods changed in small, unnerving ways. Pitch from the pines sharpened, like a fresh cut somewhere just out of sight. The loam took on a copper edge, and I told myself it was just a trick of temperature and the creek churning up red dirt below. Every few minutes I tested the rhythm. Stop, and a half breath later the other footsteps stopped. Walk, and they walked. Stumble a little, and the echoes stumbled the same. Once, when I misjudged a route and knocked small stones loose, I heard a matching scrape behind me where there were no stones to scrape. The ridge gave me a choice I didn't want. Straight ahead, the trail lifted onto exposed rock where any print would stamp. Clear. To the right, it squeezed into low-growing laurel, twisted into hoops and elbows. I took the laurel, crouching, moving slow enough to keep branches from slapping. The second steps hesitated, then adjusted, the sound of a body learning how to fold itself the way mine was folded. A leaf brushed my mouth with a damp, bitter taste. At a narrow point, the brush pressed tight to my chest and back. I don't know why I did it, but I put my hand out and touched a branch I had just pushed through. It was vibrating, barely, as if something had let it go a second after me. I broke back onto the main path at a small cairn somebody had built out of flint chips and one chunk of quartz. A bent nail jutted from a weather-soft fence post. On the nail hung a scrap of reflective tape that would catch a headlamp like a cat's eye. It wasn't there when I went up. I knew, because I don't miss bright things on dark days. Beside the post, dust held a scatter of prints that made no tidy story. Some angled in, some angled out, and one pair faced each other toe to toe the way two people stand when they can't agree who moves first. I didn't think long. I turned my shoulders downhill and put my weight into the return. The second steps kept tempo. I started to talk, which isn't like me, but silence had begun to feel like water swallowing me inch by inch. I said my name, my route, the time I planned to be out. I said it steady, like I was checking myself against a list. After a few sentences, the other voice entered, smudged and late, matching the shape of my words but missing pieces, as if repeating after a teacher through a bad door. I picked up speed when the trail allowed, let rocks roll under my boots and took the small ankle-snap risks you take when you want to be done. Near the final switchback, the trees thinned to a fringe and the lot showed through, the dull rectangle of my truck, the silver bite of the tailgate latch. Relief made me careless. I clicked on my headlamp to pick the last safe line down and painted the path in white. The world beyond the beam stepped back. And then, right there in the light, 3 boot prints appeared ahead of me in a row, deep and clean, the edges dark wet like fresh clay, landing where my next 3 steps would go if I didn't feel like changing my mind. I stopped so fast my knee popped. The second rhythm stopped late, respectful of its own rules. I turned off the lamp and let the dark come down again. Somewhere a barred owl started with its old joke, then stopped halfway, like it remembered who else was listening. "Keep going," the dragged version of my voice said, right beside my left ear now. I could feel breath that wasn't mine touch the fine hair on my neck and move it the wrong direction. I wanted to run and I wanted to kneel, and neither felt allowed. I stepped forward and my boots sank into the first print. It fit too well. I took the second and the third, and the path became itself again, ordinary as a worn stair. At the trailhead, crushed limestone glittered with old mica, and the shape of the parking lot put a hard edge on the night. I could see my truck clearly, the little dent in the driver's door that's shaped like a coin you tried to flick and lost. I looked back the way you look back when you know you shouldn't. No reason, no logic, just the animal in you needing proof. The prints behind me ended at the switchback and did not continue. Not smudged, not scuffed, not washed by some trick of wind. Ended as if lifted out of the earth by careful hands. I waited, because I wanted whoever shared my steps to pass me and go on, to show themselves as a simple, solvable thing. The woods pressed their mouth close to my ear and said nothing at all. I got in the truck and sat without turning the key. The door shut with that dry sound of rubber tired from too many summers. I looked at my phone. No bars. My breath fogged the glass a little. The rearview mirror had been nudged up, not far, just enough to show me the line of the ridge over my shoulder and the place where the prints had stopped. I tilted it down and saw my own eyes, touched the mirror once, and felt a smear that wasn't oil from my skin. It was fine dust, damp and cold. I wiped it with my sleeve, and it left a faint outline of my hand in the glass for a second before the dark carried it away. I drove home slow, like any wrong twitch might call something out of the trees to match me again, step for step, word for word, until I forgot which rhythm I'd started with. Story 2, The Whistle Beyond the Switchbacks. Beartooth starts climbing like a problem you should have solved earlier in the day, and by the 4th switchback my phone was a dead mirror, my bravado a lighter with only one stubborn spark left. I carried a headlamp I didn't want to use, and a small radio that pulled more weather than music, the kind that coughs out chants of showers in a voice that might as well be a prayer. The trail's gravel was the tired grey of old bone, and every turn felt like going back to face the same question with the same wrong answer. On the 7th switchback, the sound began. 3 notes climbing, 2 falling, thin and tidy, like someone practicing kindness. It wasn't a tune I knew, but it was a tune someone had known long enough to make it comfortable. I tried to stack it in the ordinary places. A bird, a kid with a cheap whistle, some lost echo of a campsite below. But the switchbacks folded the night like a fan, and every time the trail snapped back on itself, the whistle moved upslope, staying just out of sight a little ahead, like it was scouting the bend for me. The radio hissed once and shut up. Somewhere far off, a creek rattled like a pocket full of nickels, and the wind blew the laurel into a sound that might have been words if I had been willing to call it that. I kept my feet square and steady, the way you do when you want to look more sure than you feel. At the 9th turn, wood smoke got into the air for a breath, sweet and thin, as if there was a camp cupped behind the hill with careful hands. The map I'd memorized said, no camps, for miles. I told myself some old log held the day's heat and was only now letting it go. I rounded a waist-high boulder that wore a bead of condensation like a single tear and saw, 10 yards ahead, a cigarette ember resting in the dark, not moving, not drawing, just there, the way a red eye on a machine tells you the power's still connected. It didn't watch me. It measured me. You coming up or turning back? A voice called, not mean, not friendly, just sure of itself, in the way of people who wake up every morning exactly where they went to sleep. I heard my own breath answer first. Then I said I'd be passing through, and I said it like a promise I intended to keep. The ember blinked once and went out, and the whistle slid down the slope behind my left shoulder, so close I could have turned and cupped it in my hand. That made me mad in the small way you get mad when you're scared, at the sound for being so close to what I can't do anything about. I walked on because the only way to make a trail stop asking is to run out of trail. Switchback 10, 11, 12, the numbers losing their edges as the mountain leaned harder, the whistle always a step ahead, now soft as breathing under a door. I tried the radio again. It breathed a single word, advisory, and gave up. My lamp stayed off, and the dark was honest about the rocks under my boots. I started to say my route out loud, the way you do when you want the woods to mark you as a person with a plan. Parking lot, Beartooth up, summit turn, back by midnight. The whistle stitched itself into my sentences. 3 up, 2 down, like it was counting with me. I said I had water, I had a light, I had sense enough to turn if weather came. I didn't say I had a knife because I did, but it felt like lying. On the last pull, the ridge spooled out into a small, stubborn flat, and there in the middle was a ring of stones blackened by other nights. No flame, no coal, but when I crouched and put my palm over the ash, a curl of warmth found the skin like a cat that doesn't belong to anyone. In the center of the ash was a handprint pressed deep, deeper than mine when I tried it beside, the fingers longer and careful, like the person who left it wanted to be known without being seen. I felt my heart argue about turning back right there, but the mountain had already said, "Keep going," in a dozen ways, and it felt rude to pretend I hadn't heard. Past the ring, a path I didn't remember cut off toward the right, tighter and darker, and my map, which is a good map, had nothing to say about it. The whistle went quiet all at once, like someone had put 2 fingers on its throat. In the quiet, I heard what you don't want to hear, a second pair of ankles adjusting weight on loose stone, the scratch of grit under a heel that isn't yours, then the sound a lighter makes when the wheel turns without catching. I stood there until the night settled back over itself. Then I asked the darkness if I had permission to pass. I don't normally talk to empty spaces, but out here nothing is empty and anything can be polite. No answer came. Or if it did, it came in a language older than the one I use. I went on. The summit marker was a rusted post with a cap someone had hammered flat. My headlamp made a halo around it I didn't deserve. I stood long enough to pretend the view, then turned for home, ready to spend my fear on downhill miles where it always feels cheaper. The whistle did not come along. It hung somewhere below, patient. I made the first switchback. The second counted steps, counted blessings, whatever worked, until the lot's pale gravel showed between trunks like a small lake someone forgot to name. I thought how good the truck seat would feel and how a locked door is a spell that still holds power in these counties. I came out of the trees to the smell of hot brakes that weren't mine and saw my truck sitting the way I left it except for one small truth. The driver's door was open enough to suggest, not enough to insist. I stopped and let the math do itself. I'm a person who locks things, even when there's no point. The gap was not wind. It was invitation or report. The whistle started again, not from the trail now, but from the dark corner of the lot, where the light is always worst. 3 up, 2 down. With a tone, like air going through teeth that don't line right. I called out a hello with a name attached, because using a name can make a man into a neighbor for as long as it takes to find a better plan. No answer, unless you count the little scrape of rubber on gravel a shoe makes when someone decides where to put their weight next. I walked sideways to give myself the angle on the cab, saw no one in the mirrors, tasted something like penny water, and laid my hand on the door. The inside light didn't come on. A fuse maybe, or maybe the first part of a story someone else had planned. The seat was where I left it, the floor clean except for the fine ash smear on the mat. 5 ovals where a hand had rested and lifted and rested again. I shut the door and it latched against me without help, like hands do when they've done the same work too many times. The whistle stopped. The radio woke a second to mumble, "Clear overnight." I put the key in, but didn't turn it. Looked in the rear view just to make sure the mountain was still there, and found the glass tilted to show the ring of trees behind the lot, and a small place among them where the dark seemed shaped like a person not standing or sitting, but waiting. I adjusted the mirror down to see my own face, and left one dull streak of ash across my cheek that I didn't notice until home. And even then, washing it off felt like erasing a signature someone had put on me on purpose. I drove slow along the switchbacks with the window cracked, listening for the tune that wasn't a tune, hoping I'd hear it fade behind me. It didn't follow. It kept its place on the mountain. But when I parked in my own gravel and killed the engine, the night breezed through the maples and found a way to hum 3 up, 2 down against my gutter, and I stood there a long while pretending to tie a boot that was already tied, trying to decide which places I go belong to me, and which places only let me pass because I asked the right way. Story 3, lantern moving across the ridgeline, pine lick has a way of narrowing the world until it feels like you're walking a fence rail across the top of some old iron spine, and by the time I reached the long, bare run, I'd used up most of my brightness on the climb, leaving the kind of cautious glow that keeps you honest about your footing and little else. The moon was up there someplace, but smothered in weather, and the sky had that damp metal colour that eats depth and turns near and far into the same flat sheet. Wind came through in measured breaths and laid the grass down and let it stand again, like it was showing me how time works up here. I hadn't planned to be on the ridge at midnight, but plans in these mountains are like paper boats, pretty until you set them down in moving water. I stopped to drink, tasted my own metal bottle, and that was when I saw the lantern. It was small but steady, the kind that swings from a hand that knows the trail by memory more than by light. It wasn't on my ridge, but on the sister ridge across the dark seam of the hollow, moving parallel as if the two of us were boats on a black river, keeping a careful, impersonal company. I've seen camp lanterns before, the clumsy pulses when somebody fiddles, the jitter when a wind gust gets mouthy. This one didn't fuss. It tipped a little to the pace and corrected itself, and that tidiness made the hair at the back of my neck stand up like the grass. I don't like to surprise other nightwalkers, so I lifted my headlamp and blinked 3 quick for friendly, 2 long for lost, the old trail talk. The lantern paused, held long enough to feel like eye contact, and then tipped. A small nod you'd give a stranger on a narrow sidewalk when you both choose not to know more. The wind turned and brought me a taste of creekstone and leaf tannin and another smell underneath, faint and sweet, like paper smoke left in a pocket. Separate from the smells there came a kind of talking, not words I could borrow, just a shape of conversation, one voice low, another lower, overlapping so closely that sense could not find a place to sit. The lantern's light grew softer as it angled behind a standing snag and then reappeared with the same patience. I felt eyes in my chest and made myself breathe slow. To break the feeling that we were moving together, I cut down off the ridge through rhododendron that had knuckled itself into hoops and elbows, crouching so the leaves didn't slap and announce me. It's a mean plant to fight at night. It holds you with green arms and asks you what secret you thought you were keeping. I wanted to force a separation of our lines. But the lantern across the way didn't care about brush or gullies, or the places where feet would tangle. It kept level, precise, gliding with a grace that felt less like walking and more like a decision being carried. My light fell across a patch of clay, slick from a days-old rain, and I saw fresh boot tracks cutting along the slope. Deep heel, shallow toe, a man working against gravity. The next print faced uphill, toe dug in like he'd turned to call back. The one after that pointed down, as if whoever made them had argued with himself in the space of a single step and never settled it. A little farther on, at the saddle where the ridges touch and change names, an old fence post waited that hadn't meant anything to me on the way up. Someone had hammered a bent nail into it at a height that would catch a hand without a strain. Off the nail hung a scrap of reflective tape that would pop like a cat's eye in a beam. The tape hadn't been there earlier, I'm sure, because I am the kind of man who notices the bright laziness of trash in a wild place. I put 2 fingers on the post and felt the faint tack of sap, fresh, as if bark had been cut that afternoon. The voices carried again, lower now but clearer in their intent. The way you can tell the difference between prayer and bookkeeping even when you can't hear the words. I said something then, not loud, just the kind of sentence you offer a room to make yourself visible. I'm crossing. I mean no harm. I'll be gone soon. Across the hollow, the lantern dimmed to a coin and then swung back into full. The wind pushed cold air up the slopes like a tide and brought the smell of wood smoke again. Not campfire smoke exactly, but the dry, thin smoke you get from paper and small, weightless things. I moved on because standing felt like volunteering. Every 20 steps I checked the other ridge, and every time I looked the light was still there. Not gaining or losing, just matching. I tried a trick and killed my lamp. Let the trace of the trail show itself by the difference in texture underfoot and the small shine where boots had polished quartz to a dull star. In the dark, the lantern looked closer, and for a wild second I thought it had crossed the distance between us, that the hollow had folded up like a map and put our ridges side by side. I turned the beam back on and put myself in the world I knew. The trail reached an open run that carried sound, and a voice came with the wind that might have been mine after a long illness. Keep your line. It wasn't mean, it was instruction, like you tell somebody where to set their hand on a rung. I did as I was told because I had already been doing it. Somewhere above, the sky finally found a crack, and the moon showed me a colorless picture. 2 ridges, 2 thin paths, a line where the timber thinned and the old pasture began. I couldn't tell you why I trusted a thing I did not like, but I kept my line, and the fear that had been full in my chest lowered a finger. A quarter mile beyond the saddle, the lantern began to sink, slow as breath. Not a blink, not a loss of fuel, just a decision to go low. It dropped into the fold where the old farm road sinks and lay there like a coal under ash. My light bit into the ferns and caught a scattering of mica that looked like quiet eyes. I stood long enough to make it rude. The lantern did not rise again. When the dark took that coin of light, the night got heavier, the way a door gets heavier when somebody leans on it from the other side. I made the last of the ridge in a kind of practiced calm that isn't calm at all, just a trick you do so your feet will do something right. I came into the trees and they drew close like old gossip. The lot showed up in patches the way water shows through rocks in a dry creek. My truck sat where I'd left it, and for the first time all night I felt a little foolish. Like I'd been shadow boxing with a neighbor who was just walking home. I reached for the handle and saw, reflected in the side glass, a slice of the ridge behind me, nothing else. I opened the door and the dome light didn't come on. Before I could decide if that mattered, I felt something small and practical. A line tugged. The rearview mirror, which I keep angled to watch my own bad posture, had been nudged. Not much, just enough to show the ridge dead center, the precise line where the lantern had traveled. I put 2 fingers on the mirror and felt a grit I hadn't made, a powder as fine as ash. I wiped it and left a faint handprint that looked like it had always been there until the night breathed and thinned it back to ordinary dust. I sat down, shut the door, listened for a car that wasn't there, for a voice that was out of breath. When I finally turned the key, the radio coughed and offered me a forecast without conviction. I adjusted the mirror down to catch my eyes and caught instead a small square of reflection out past my tailgate. Just a bent nail on an old post and a scrap of tape, blinking slow in some other light I couldn't name. On the drive home, I kept waiting to see the lantern swing through the trees beside me, keeping pace. But the road belonged to me in the mean, practical way roads do. Back in my own gravel, the house looked like a thing I'd borrowed instead of a place I owned. I stood in the doorway and listened to the wind move along the roofline, a soft, steady pass you could call a lantern if you needed it to be. And I told myself that up on Pine Lick, maybe somebody else was walking a clean line on a parallel ridge, measuring me the same way I measured them, both of us clicking our lights on and off at polite distances, nodding without wanting to know more, and deciding, somewhere we could not see, which doors would be heavier the next time we tried to open them. Story 4. Knock at the trail shelter door. The shelter sat on its stilts above the creek, like an old dog keeping its paws out of the wet. The boards were silver from years of rain, and the tin roof rattled when the wind found its grip. Down below, the creek spoke in a voice of rounded stones, a constant low murmur that made you feel like you were interrupting a private conversation just by listening. Nobody else had signed the register that week, just me, a date, and a note about the weather. A few pages back, I saw the same odd warning written more than once. Courtesy knock after midnight. I chalked it up to trail humor, the kind of inside joke that keeps a place feeling alive. The rain started just after dark, heavy enough to take the smell out of the air and press it into the wood. I strung my pack on a nail, lit the little tea candle I carry for comfort, and let the creek talk me into stillness. Around 1, when my eyes had gone soft and my breath was starting to stretch, it came, a single knock. Not loud, not hurried, just one knuckle, hollow against wet wood. I called out, offered space if someone needed it. No answer. Rain filled the silence, steady and calm. The second knock came 5 minutes later, softer, nearer the hinge, like it was adjusting its position. I stood and opened the door to a wall of rain, the beam of my headlamp catching nothing but the glassy glare of wet leaves. The woods stared back without blinking. I closed the door, hung it again on its nail, told myself the wind could do tricks when it was bored. When the third knock came, it wasn't on the door. It came from inside, low near the floorboards, as though something was asking to come up from under us. The creek's voice faltered as if it too had stopped to listen. I brought the beam down slow and saw them. 2 wet prints, bare, adult-sized, the toes wide and splayed, like they'd grown used to gripping stone instead of soil. They started at the threshold and ended just short of my boots. No turn back, no smudge, just there. I sat the rest of the night with my back against the wall, knees drawn, watching the dark breathe in the corners. The rain counted out the minutes on the roof in a pattern that felt practiced, as if the night had been keeping time for something other than me. I kept waiting for another knock, but it didn't come. Only the sound of the creek, lower now, slower, like it had lost interest in speaking. When grey seeped in, I went to the door. Outside, the ground was slick with mud, and rain had left it soft enough to take a print. Just to the left of the step, in a clean patch, someone had written in long, even strokes with the point of a stick, "Thank you for the invitation." The letters were careful, almost polite, except for the last line, where the stick had dug too deep, breaking the shape, as though the hand holding it didn't want to let go. I stood there longer than I needed to, watching the words melt in the drizzle. There were no footprints leading in or out from where the message lay. Just that patch of disturbed earth, the soft curve of each letter already beginning to wash into nothing, and the sense, quiet but certain, that the knock had not been asking for shelter. It had been checking if I knew the right way to say yes. Story 5. Voices Rising. From the laurel thickets never feel empty, even when you can swear you're alone. They grow in on you, glossy leaves pressed together like the walls of a tunnel, every surface slick with a green shine that turns the air close and stale. I'd been moving through one of those tunnels for the better part of an hour, the trail barely wide enough for my boots, when I heard them. 2 voices, low, the way families argue late at night when they don't want to wake the house. The sound wasn't coming from ahead or behind, just inside the walls, as if the laurel itself had a mouth. I couldn't make out words, only the shape of their talk, rising and falling, then flattening to a kind of hush when I stopped. I did what you do out here. I spoke up, loud enough to carry, steady enough to sound like a man and not a question. Coming through, the voices shifted at once into laughter that didn't rise, didn't break. It stayed low, tucked into the damp leaf mold, the sound of amusement that doesn't need air. My skin tightened under my shirt. The trail narrowed and the ground changed, damp, to the point my boots left clean imprints. That's when I saw them. Long drag marks, deep enough to hold a little shine. They stretched in the direction I was headed, as if something had been pulled by the ankles. No blood, no torn leaves, just the fact of it. My pack seemed heavier, though I hadn't taken on weight. At head height, a flash of color caught my eye. A blue bandana, tied to a twig in a scout knot, one I'd learned as a kid. There was no wind in that tunnel, but it twisted slowly, showing both sides like it wanted me to see. It was whole. I didn't tie it. No one had passed me since I started. I pressed on until the trail opened into a clearing, a circle maybe 20 feet across, framed by laurel that stood taller than me. The voices followed me in, climbing now, up into the branches, splitting into more than two until it was a scatter of sound, like a flock changing trees. I realized then I hadn't heard a single bird since the first whisper, not one. The air felt stripped of anything alive except me. In the center of the clearing stood a cairn, 5 stones high. The top rock was darker than the rest, slick as if breathed on, warm under my palm. No dew anywhere else, but here the stone held a living damp. I lifted it, and underneath was a note folded in half. The paper was rough, like it had been carried too long in a pocket. It said, "Please keep to the path." The letters were mine, not just my handwriting, my rhythm, my slant, the way I never closed the loop on a lowercase a. My first thought was that I'd written it and forgotten, but the paper was dry in places, my hands were wet, and I had nothing in my pack that would leave that kind of crease. I set the rock back, but the stone didn't seem to sit right anymore. I stood there, looking at the laurel walls, at the way the leaves all angled slightly inward, like they were listening. I thought about turning back, but the drag marks I'd seen earlier ran the other way too, in fresh over-old, as if something had been walked up and down more than once. I left the clearing by the opposite trail, because forward felt safer than meeting something coming back. The voices didn't follow, but they didn't stop either. They stayed behind me, overlapping in that same low way, just far enough back to make turning around useless. The air didn't loosen until I came out onto a ridge where the trees broke for sky. When I finally reached my truck at the trailhead, I put my pack down and noticed a blue bandana tied to the driver's side mirror. Same knot, same slow twist in a wind I couldn't feel. I untied it and stuffed it in the glove box without thinking, but all the way home, I could hear the faint sound of voices under the road noise, speaking in the same hush as the laurel. Low, close to the ground, never quite rising enough to breathe. Story 6. Trail Register, signed with my name. At the gap, there's a tin box wired to a post, lid bent from years of boots kicking it open and shut, pencil tied with twine that smells faintly of rain. I signed my name at 6:14 a.m., weather fair, heading northbound. There's something about a trail register, more ritual than necessity. You write it for someone you'll never meet, a breadcrumb left in pencil before the green swallows you. 8 miles in, I came across a second box, the kind most hikers ignore. I lifted the lid just to see, expecting old pages curling from damp. But the sheet on top was fresh and beaded with morning's leftover moisture. My name sat there in neat block letters, same as I'd written earlier, but steadier, like I'd taken my time. The time beside it was 6:14 p.m., and under direction, it said, "Going south." I stared until the paper blurred. Someone had to be joking, I thought. But the neatness of it made me uncomfortable. The letters were mine, but the patience wasn't. I picked up the pace, telling myself I'd laugh when I caught the prank. Still, I started noticing small corrections in the world. A stick laid across the trail where I'd stepped over one that morning. A candy wrapper tucked under a rock like a flag corner, shiny in a place it shouldn't have been. Nothing big enough to stop me, just enough to keep me glancing behind. The air was beginning to hold its breath, that metallic taste that creeps in before a storm or something worse. At the third register, I flipped open the lid and found only one line written on the page. Turn around. No date, no time, no name. Just that. The handwriting was mine again. My looped R and the way I always slant down on the last letter. I stood there longer than I should have, the woods around me strangely flat. The colour sucked out until the green looked like an old photograph. I didn't turn. The trail ahead felt like it was pulling me instead of me moving forward. Roots showed in patterns I didn't remember. The usual trail sounds. The little wing snaps in the undergrowth. The creak of branches had gone missing. My shadow seemed to lag a little behind when I stepped. Not enough to say for sure, but enough that I noticed. By the time I reached the last box near the lot, the light was wrong. Not darker, just thinner, like the day had been stretched too far. The lid lifted easy, and the paper inside was bone dry, brittle even. My name filled every single line, one under the other, the handwriting getting looser with each repetition until the last was barely letters at all, just grooves cut deep as if the hand had run out of paper long before it ran out of whatever need made it right. I stood there with the box open, the twine-tied pencil swinging gently, though there was no wind. The woods felt close behind me, like someone leaning in to read over my shoulder. I closed the register and stepped back, not sure if I was leaving or being let go. When I reached my truck, the cab smelled faintly of graphite. My pack was sitting in the passenger seat instead of the bed, and the top zipper was open. Inside, my trail map was unfolded, my name written in the margins over and over in that same steady hand, each one pointing a small arrow south. Story 7. The Creek Crossing After Midnight. I missed the last edge of daylight by 10 minutes and paid for it at the creek. It isn't wide there, only 10 steps across if you pick them right, but it's quick and shallow like a mad dog, always reaching, always talking faster than you can think. The air had that used up feeling the woods get after a hot day, the kind that scrapes the throat and leaves you thirsty for something that isn't there. I stood on the near bank and found the line I wanted, a big flat stone that looked friendly, 2 fist-sized points in the run where the water thinned to lace, then a final slab with a lip that would take a boot. I told myself I'd crossed worse and meant it, even if that comfort felt borrowed. I kept the headlamp low because white light on water will trick your depth, and first step in the creek is a kind of promise you make to whatever lies under it. The current took my ankles like a cold hand trying a door. I went light over the first rock, found the second with a scrape that set my teeth on edge, and was reaching for the third when the beam caught someone downstream, knee-deep back to me, facing upstream like they were counting time by the current. They were fixed and steady, not bracing, not testing footing, just there, a dark cutout against the run. "You good?" I called because you do not leave a person to water and their own stubbornness in these counties. The creek talked over me and the figure did not answer. They didn't turn. They didn't do anything. They held their place the way a fence post holds a corner. I made the third rock and stood there long enough to feel foolish, water untying the heat from my shins. "You need a hand?" I tried. The figure turned their head the smallest amount, slow as a clock hand correcting itself, and in that small turn, the headlamp slid across a face slick with creek water. Not a blink, not a wince, no fear or urgency, just attention. It was a way of looking that met me without taking me in. I put my next step on instinct and went for the far bank. choosing a low scramble through blackberry and sapling because the trail, such as it was, shot away at a mean angle and the bank gave me more ground than grace. Brush took a piece of my sleeve and I took it back. I came out on the leaf litter, set the lamp down the path and felt my stomach fold when I saw the wet prints there ahead of me, dark where mine would be dark, deep where I'm heavy, angled toward my next turn like they had read my intention. The tread was mine. The little nick in the heel from a nail I found in a barn back home was there like a signature. I crouched, and while I was crouched, the figure in the creek lifted an arm and pointed to the opposite bank. Not a wave, not a threat, just a finger back across the water, the way a parent points to the sidewalk when a kid's step has drifted where it shouldn't. The trail ahead smelled wrong. Pennies and old rope, that flat metal bite under a sweet rot, like blood and nylon left in a damp shed. I trust my nose when the woods don't agree with my eyes. I listened to the creek try to talk me into making a mistake and let the figure have the final say. I turned and walked the wet prints back to the water's lip. When my boots touched the current, the sound the river made changed, got higher and somehow gentler, like it was easing its shoulder to let me by. I took the old line in reverse and it felt like the creek had lowered itself for me, dropping a hand off my ankle, crouching a little to prove a point I wasn't sure I wanted proven. On the original bank I climbed onto the root-snarled shelf where people wait when they wish they'd timed this better. I looked back to thank or question or curse. I don't know which, and the figure was not there. The surface of the water kept a darker oval where they had stood, the current sliding around that absence as if the shape remained, refusing to join the rest of the river. The headlamp made it shine around the edges like a coin under ice. It did not move on. It did not fill. The creek made room for a person who wasn't standing there anymore. Going back upstream meant paying interest on time I didn't have, so I chose the short line out. A deer path that crosses Old Cut and finds the forest road in 2 sharp turns. You can hear the road before you see it, a far, steady hush that feels like safety when you want it to. The path showed fresh scuffs, and I told myself deer are everywhere until you need them to be. The night had settled into that hour where things that live by sound start to own the ground. The headlamp picked out spider eyes like bits of green glass. The wet prints appeared on dirt where there wasn't water to make them, dark ovals that matched mine, exactly spaced slightly ahead. They curved where I meant to curve, they paused where I meant to pause, at the old stump that looks like a face, at the downed poplar with the soft belly that gives under your boot and makes a noise like a man clearing his throat. I said my route out loud because a voice can keep you intact when the land starts to take liberties. I named the landmarks I knew as if that would make them know me back. Poplar, stump, 2 stones like shoulders, the break in the fence. The prince took each one in order. I wanted to be angry at the joke, but the part of me that understands debt knew the current would have taken my legs if I'd argued wrong. Up ahead, the path narrowed between laurel that had grown tall enough to form a cold, green hallway. I stopped there, and the prince stopped in front of me, and I heard water where there was no water, a low rush inside the leaves, as if the creek had sent its voice up the hill to keep me company. The second crossing, there's always a second you forget about when you plan a night escape, was only a ditch, but it held water like a secret, black and quiet between banks cut deep years. I'll go by something heavier than rain. My light showed a log laid across. It wasn't there when I'd come up. The bark was slick and had that pale seam where wood shows through like bone. I put a foot on it, and the voice of the creek rose so close it might have been beneath the log. "Not that," is what I heard, though I couldn't tell you what language carried it. I stepped back, slipped my boots into the mud, and went around. On the far side, the prints I'd been following were waiting in the leaf litter, as if they'd stood there a while and got bored. At the road, I expected relief to crack me open, But what I felt was a kind of strange grief, like leaving a grave you dug yourself. My truck sat white in the ditch pull-off, shining in the headlamp like a winter animal. The driver's door was shut, thank God, but the window had fogged from the inside and left 5 clear ovals where a hand had pressed and then slid down and away. I put my palm over them and matched each one without meaning to. The glass had that creak chill on it, and my breath left blooming circles that took their time thinning. I didn't start the engine right off. I sat in the dark with the headlamp off, the woods pressing close, and tried to count the ways I could have told the night no. I didn't like any of the answers. When I finally turned the key, the dome light came up and made the cab look stage fake. In the rear view, the road behind held a shadow that kept its shape long after my taillights should have boiled everything to amber. It looked like the dent in the water, but stretched thin and patient along the gravel, the way a creek leaves its mark on stone and keeps it through drought. I drove slow until the hush of the forest road gave up to the steady voice of the highway. At home, I took off my boots on the porch, and water, not much, not enough to mop, ran out of the laces and disappeared between the boards. All night the gutters hummed against a wind that wasn't there, 3 houses away and 3 counties deep, the sound of a river that had learned my name and said it without asking for anything, which is somehow worse.